Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. There's more information on our website, womensdeclaration.com, where you will find the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which has been signed by 36,232 people from 160 countries and is supported by and signed by 507 organisations. We have many volunteer activists, including country contacts from every continent engaged in defending women's rights. Please do join us as a volunteer. Today, we are going to have a discussion entitled, "Is Therapy Useful for Feminist Struggle?" And the discussion is with Sheila Jeffreyes, Zanne D'Aglio, who are going to sort of lead off the discussion and talk at the first part of it, and bringing in me, Brew, and Lila Namdarkhan further into the discussion. And that will go on for about an hour. And then we're going to hear a video. We're going to watch a video that was recorded in late June, a webinar, and we're going to hear from Carola, López, Moya, who about cancel culture and transgenderism as a cult, and that's in Spanish. So we're going to now have the discussion, which will start off with Sheila Jeffreyes and Zanne D'Aglio discussing and is therapy useful for feminist struggle. So Zanne, you're going to start off, so over to you, Zanne.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. So I want to just introduce the topic, how it came about, and how this forum came about. Recently, Jo, Sheila, and I were at an FQT webinar planning meeting, and I really don't remember what exactly we were talking about, but Sheila said something about the word empowerment, and I asked her what she meant. Then in there, I learned something new. We talked very briefly about our differences in experiences and thinking about therapy, and decided it would be a good FQT topic because many other women probably don't know, as I did not know, the story behind the word, and more generally about the history of therapy and feminism. So I'll hand it over to Sheila now.
What we're going to do is that I'm going to talk about the history. I'm going to talk about the 1970s, really, of feminism and therapy. And I'm going to bring Zanne in at various points to talk about what she knows about, which is what was happening around therapy in the 80s and in the 90s. So I need to say that how I got involved in the politics of mental health and why therapy became an issue for me. Back in the early 1970s, when I became involved in women's liberation, the therapy industry was in its infancy. I mean, nobody was in therapy. There wasn't therapy as we understand it now. There was psychiatry, there was psychoanalysis, but not really, at least in this country, therapy. So I became involved in the politics of mental health at that time because I was only just recovering from quite severe depression. And I was on antidepressants at that, in the late 1960s, early 70s. And I'd also experienced some form of therapy with the, I suppose you could call it therapy, with the university psychiatrist, who was a woman, and a quite traditional woman, who analyzed my dreams and told me that I was afraid of male sexuality. So that's where I was at before I became involved in the politics of mental health. Now, I think it's very important to start with the history because probably a lot of people now, a lot of women now, don't realize that there was a time before therapy. Therapy is just accepted, like the rain that falls from the skies. You know, there is therapy, lots of women do therapy, and so on. It's become so completely commonplace as a recourse for unhappy women that many may be unable to imagine a time before it. And it's important to say that therapy is, in fact, an industry for women. Women go to therapists at twice the rate of men, and 80% of therapists in the UK are women. These facts alone suggest it's a feminist issue, and we should probably also mention here that you don't need any training for it. Anybody in the UK can set themselves up as a therapist, which is actually, I think, a quite frightening thought. Okay, so Zanne, I'll go over to you.
Thanks, Sheila. So I'm going to speak from my experience as well. My first encounter with therapy was in 1981. I was 21. I was not a feminist. I hadn't come out yet, nor developed a sense of community. I had a crush on a girlfriend who recommended a therapist who happened to be her friend. And he did hypnotherapy and quickly ascertained that my issues were not a crush, but about my father, his illness, and his early death. He also recommended I go to a 12-step program called Adult Children of Alcoholics, because he said living with a very ill parent is like living with an alcoholic. So in the next 5 years or so, I found my way to Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous within the lesbian community. And I came out in what was called the sober community, though my use of drugs and alcohol was not in hindsight really the problem. These regular meetings, which may have similarities to feminist consciousness-raising groups, eventually replaced private therapy. And by far, I have to say, the 12-step meetings, the sharing about your experiences, the community, the friendships, and the teachings gave me what I consider essential mental health life skills. So I'm going to go back to Sheila. She's going to continue with the 1970s.
Yes, and I noticed somebody in the chat says that in the 1970s in their women's community, they were doing various kinds of therapy. In the very early therapy, in the 70s, that wasn't really happening. And indeed, there wasn't really much feminism then. But in the 70s, therapy exploded. There some instead of psychiatrists, of course, there was some critique of power. There was something like co-counseling. That was one of the things that came over from the States. And that was by the mid-70s, co-counseling was huge. So there were many, many different kinds of therapy coming over at that time. But at the beginning of the 70s, that wasn't so. And today, mental health is barely discussed as a feminist issue. But it was central to our concerns at that time. I mean, it's astonishing now that we don't, within this movement that's happening now, politicize therapy and politicize mental health at all. I joined a women and mental health group in West London in the early 70s, and it met under a flyover. Now, all of us had had issues with our mental health, and we formed a very political self-help group to discuss the issue and be activists on the issue of mental health for feminists. None of us did therapy at that time, and indeed at that time we saw it as the enemy. So over to you, Zanne.
So I'm gonna spring into the 90s because the 80s went by really quick for me. During the 90s is a really key point in my life. During the 1990s, I lived in Germany in the lesbian community where I adopted radical lesbian feminist politics. No one talked about therapy. We lived communally in what are called, I think so, WGs, Wohngemeinschaften. I felt liberated, literally, from the psychologically focused narratives of the 1980s US. It was a turning point, and since then, I've become increasingly critical of the culture of commercializing human relationships, or human relations, better said. I see it as just another way that neoliberalism transforms political and social problems into those of the individual. And from living in Germany, I also came to understand, in hindsight, how innately American and individualistic I was, and still am. Sheila.
Thanks, Sam. So our critique of therapy in the early 1970s came from somewhere. We didn't invent it all on our own. there was at that time an anti-psychiatry movement. And the anti-psychiatry movement developed in the 1960s and attacked the psychiatric profession and the idea of diagnoses and so on. And the foundational text really for that was Thomas Satz's book, The Myth of Mental Illness, from 1981. And he went so far as to say that mental illness was indeed a myth. So he argues that the concept of mental illness made no sense. And he said, of course, that the problems that people experienced were the result of a problematic society. So it was the society that created what was seen as the illness. And his book led to the whole anti-psychiatry movement. And there was trenchant criticism of the whole history of psychiatry and psychoanalysis. Can you carry on, Zanne?
So relating to what Sheila said, I started to take note of the ubiquity of the phrases mental health and mental health issues actually rather recently, again in the US, where I believe these ideas often originate and are quickly commodified. And this commodification, that is, turning something into goods or a service, effectively absorbs and conceals its social and political characteristics. So, for example, I believe that a therapist could, in some cases, replace good friendships, consciousness-raising groups, or 12-step programs. I had never heard of this book and the authors as until just now, when Sheila pointed it out. But I think that the industry has existed my entire life. So I never really, at my entire adult life, so I never really had an orientation or a knowledge of there being a before therapy, basically. Back over to you, Sheila.
Thank you. Now, what Thomas Saz did was he rejected the idea of diagnosis and mental health. It was important to reject diagnosis. I mean, nobody knows about this now, but women at that time, as they still are now, were given a very wide range of diagnoses to explain their problems created, we understood, mainly by male domination, and that's still going on. I was told by my psychiatrist at university, for instance, that I had something called depersonalization syndrome. And I looked it up at the time, of course, in a psychiatry textbook, and I found out that it was particularly common in girls and young women over 18 of above average intelligence who had bad relationships with their parents. And I like that very much. I thought, yes, sounds exactly like me. But now, of course, there's loads more diagnoses, and lots of women are seeking out diagnoses. And this is a great worry to me of ADHD, autism, personality disorders, and so on. So we're in a different time where there's no critique of any of this. Nobody understands that it ever really happened to a large extent. And there are many, many women seeking diagnoses. Anyway, over to you, Zanne.
Yeah, so it was that point of diagnoses that totally just exploded for me, because what I've observed in the last 20 years, and I've lived outside of the US, I always orient back to the US because things seem to be just sort of just always bubbling here on this level. So what I've observed in the last 20 years is the identification with having a condition. Even Illich calls it the medicalization of life in his wonderful book, The Medical Nemesis, The Expropriation of Health, published in 1975. In it, he suggests, among lots of other interesting things, that our society is one of medicalized identities. That is, if we are diagnosed with something, we actually exist. If we're not, then we really don't have a kind of identity, a medical identity, which we all have, or supposed to have. So, Sheila.
I want to go back to the anti-psychiatry movement just for a moment. And it was very important. And I noticed Francis said in the chat, what about red therapy or whatever? There was it was very radical and very much on the left, this whole critique of therapy, diagnosis, and so on at that time. It was associated with the left because it suggested that mental health came from the societal problems, for instance, of inequality. And the rejection of therapy included, the rejection of psychiatry included for many of us, the rejection of therapy, because we couldn't see therapy as completely separate. We saw it just as a variation of all these other forms of mental health supposed treatment. Now, feminists developed the anti-psychiatry approach. We took it from the movement from the 60s and we developed it, arguing that women were so frequently the victims of diagnosis and treatment because they were made unhappy by their oppression and then subjected to the misogyny of the male supposed science of psychiatry. And the feminist critique of the ideas and practices of psychiatry and how oppressive they were for women were first developed in Phyllis Chesler's Women and Madness in 1971. So we understood women's mental health problems to derive from their oppression, and women had many, many reasons for what was seen as mental ill health, such as unwanted sex, unwanted childbearing, being controlled socially, psychologically, and financially by men, men's violence, and so on. And of course, now young women are reacting against the awful problem of effeminization, in which they are degraded and created into inferiors, and many women, young women, are rejecting it. So all of those problems are creating mental ill health for women now. And it would be astonishing, of course, if women didn't manifest considerable problems, we thought, because of the seriousness of this oppression and how far-reaching it is. So I'll go over to you again now, Zanne.
So this issue of women's madness, or the word madness, I came to understand as a consequence of patriarchal oppression in the 1990s in Germany, when I was working at the Lesbian Archive, reading tons of books on women throughout history who were condemned for it. Camille Claudel comes to mind, just as one example. But in my circles at that time, it was part of our discussions and our collective consciousness, but at the same time, we were young and we were separatists, lesbians, and we felt somewhat unencumbered by the kinds of oppression relationships with men create. And in Germany, I have to say at the time, legally protected women-only spaces were with various programs, and they were usually run by feminists, were abundant. They were in almost every city. And these nurtured a sense of community and friendship that is really very hard to find at this time. Back to you, Sheila.
Yes, and I'm going to go back to the 70s again for a while, because some may be thinking, well, no, if we rejected therapy, what did we think should replace it? And I should say that in our Women and Mental Health group, our main concern was keeping women out of mental hospitals. And we saw them as places, very, very harmful places of patriarchal control of women. And we didn't think therapy was the answer. We thought the answer to women's serious mental health crises, and we knew they could be very serious, was 24-hour care by other women. And of course, that is, very idealistic. And we were not really in a position to do that. That was really quite impractical because we all had jobs, that we all had other things to do. But these were the lines along which we were thinking, rather than abandoning women to the male psychiatric profession. And so great, in fact, was our suspicion of therapy and its effects upon women that we took up Mary Daly's way of writing therapist as the -rapist. And I can remember indeed spray painting that on walls. So that's a very serious rejection we had, and a very serious hatred of therapy. And I know that Joe's going to talk more about Mary Daly later on, because we have to have her in this conversation. Now, in 1976, our group, the Women and Mental Health group, put on a conference, a Women and Mental Health conference, which I think must have been the first of its kind in the UK. And what we wanted to talk about was how best do you support women with mental health problems without recourse to hospitals, drugs, therapy. And I wrote a paper for the conference entitled Therapy or Consciousness Raising, Reform or Revolution. I explained that therapy was counter-revolutionary because instead of creating social change, It was an individual solution directed towards enabling women to cope with their oppression and fit themselves back into it. Consciousness raising, on the other hand, was a revolutionary tool, because through women getting together to examine their oppression, women could heal themselves, and by understanding that their mental health problems were the common symptoms of oppression, and work out what actions to take to end it. And of course, doing activism together, we understood, was healing in and of itself. It enabled women to express their fury and the common woman-loving joy of acting together. Activism was creative and huge fun, as with community and friendship among women that it created. This, we considered, was the way to heal women, not having them sit in a room on their own with a therapist, trying to heal from what was framed as an individual problem for which they had to take individual responsibility. Would you like to just join in here, Zanne?
Yeah, I wanted to end with absolutely the doing activism, and for me, art and spirituality are how I stay sane in this really very crazy world. And having friendships, I have to say, having friendships over decades that have been nurturing in many ways, much more than my family. Sheila.
Thank you. Now, just to explain what happened at the conference in 1976, our, really new and extraordinary conference on women and mental health, we had a nasty shock, because suddenly at the conference, a phalanx of women turned up, and as we saw it, they took over the conference. And they were the women who were setting up at that exact moment the Women's Therapy Centre in London, which was the beginning of the industry of so-called feminist therapy in Britain. And that centre is still going. And what they did was they used our conference, which was about feminist solutions, to launch their centre, which was about the creation of an industry in which women would get paid to be doing therapy on each other. And from that time onwards, feminist therapy really, really, really took off. It provided employment for women who wanted to work with women. And women were able to set themselves up as psychotherapists, so they didn't indeed need to register, they didn't need qualifications, and so on. So by the late 70s, the intrusion of therapy as a solution to the problems of women's oppression was well established. In 1978, I was in the Leeds Rape Crisis Collective, where we were all amateurs, and we aimed to help women by enabling them to see the violence they suffered as political, helping them get involved in fighting male domination with other women, and so on. And we trained each other by just sitting in circles and working things through together. But what we discovered, that the first UK Rape Crisis Centre, which was the London Rape Crisis Centre, doesn't exist now, but that's another story, was set up in London in 1976, and by the late 1970s, it had professionalized its services, which meant referral of the women victims to therapy. And we all saw therapy as the enemy. We saw this development as an abandonment of the feminist aim of supporting women by enabling them to fight back against men in favor of seeing them as the problem and fitting them back into male domination. And the feminist confrontation with male violence, of course, in the 70s came at the same time as the therapy industry was established. It's not hard to see a connection. In 1978, the American feminist who wrote the first book on incest and the effect of this violence of women, Kiss Daddy Goodnight, was published. That book was published, had lots of accounts in it. And in 1996, she published another book called Rocking the Cradle of Sexual Politics, What Happened When Women Said Incest. In her second book, she said, when she wrote her first book in 78, she thought, because many, many women, I also was collecting the accounts of women who'd been raped by their fathers at that time. We thought something would be done about it. Something would be done, something would be done. Of course, nothing was done except the setting up of the therapy industry. And in her second book, Rocking the Cradle of Sexual Politics, she explains that women were calmed down, fitted back into the system. Nothing was done about the rapists. Nothing was done about the rapists. They're all there. Still there, of course, but the women were dealt with and the women were treated. So she was absolutely furious and very distressed. This was 1996, to think that all of the work that we had all done had then been sort of rolled over by the therapy industry with nothing actually done about the problem. So there's a great deal to say, I have to say, about therapy and the ways that it's problematic for women and for our revolution, a huge number. But the main idea that I've been trying to explain today is that rather than therapy being a wonderful boon for women and something that maybe has always existed, the horror of men's violence against women and girls, which is a fundamental determinant of women's happiness, was actually covered over and covered up by therapy at this time. There are many other aspects, but that was really the one I wanted to concentrate on today. And what I'm going to do now is go over to Jo and to Lila.
In 1978, Mary Daly wrote Gynecology, and she warned us about the body and mind gynecologists of America. Now, they're more widespread, but she was talking in her book about America. She called them the physicians and the psychiatrists. So in the central chapter of this book, American Gynecology, Gynocide by the Holy Ghosts of Medicine, she wrote, in the 20th century, American women are lulled by the myths and rituals of gynecology and therapy, believing that doctor knows best. Daly added, I use the term gynecology broadly to refer to all those professions, including psychiatry and other psychotherapeutic fields, which specializes in the diseases and hygiene of women's bodies and minds. She argued that most members of the professions are motivated by loyalty to the profession rather than to women. Daly continued, some specialists in these fields are at times helpful to women, but such genuine helpfulness occurs in spite of the pervasive intent and ethos of and methods of their professions. She continues, although in some cases women have no choice other than to turn to members of the gynecological professions, it's important to remember that in many instances, despite appearances, women do not have other options. B, that frequently the best option is not to go to the specialists. Finally, even if these professions are consulted out of necessity and with good short-term results, the long-term effects often include increased physical and psychological dependency, consequent loss of autonomous creative energy needed for searching out women-identified solutions. Now, these are some of the things Daly says. She said therapy is brain cleansing. It's a surrender of women's private self to the mind gynecologist, moving her to a state of therapeutic grace, purified of originality. She said therapy is a direct response to the first wave of feminism and its deep boundary violation. On gynecology, which she says it can be body gynecology or mind gynecology, and they're linked and they're two faces of the same profession, and gynocide, the sort of the attack on women. She said the purpose and intent was and is not healing in the deep sense, but violent enforcement of the sexual caste system. So I'm just going to get another quote. In this chapter in Gynecology, Daly writes, I suggest that the God of therapy is therapy itself. Moreover, as in the case with all religions, there is a fixation upon the act of worship itself, which tends to function as a shelter against anomie, against meaninglessness. For this reason, any criticism of therapy threatens and terrorizes the therapeutized, which is an experience that many of us, if we are critical along these lines that we've been critical today, if we say where we think that therapy is unhelpful for the feminist revolution, often there's this very extreme reaction, because we could be, as Daly suggests, we could be threatening their shelter, that people saying, I needed therapy, and you're threatening me, you're destroying my life, I'm going to die if I didn't have therapy. And that leads us on to the link with transgenderism. So I really recommend everybody read this chapter, and I guess there's a PDF of it, which is the central chapter in gynecology. So Daly is critical of transgenderism in this 1978 book, and she refers to Janice Raymond's book, The Transsexual Empire, but she hadn't seen as much as we've seen, but she mentions it in her discussion of therapy and gynecology, and it's pretty clear that you can make a very strong argument that transgenderism is just a modern version of gynecology. It's part of gynecology. And so the way that argument would go is that the expansion of state-funded therapy and global therapy has gone hand in hand with the expansion of transgender ideology. Girls who don't submit to the feminine sex role stereotypes or have anxiousness or mental health issues, which are being marketed globally. You could look on the World Health Organization website where they say, oh, more and more people have these terrible mental health issues. The answer is therapy. Now, therapists, instead of girls and women fighting the class struggle against patriarchy and against their oppression, they go into closed rooms secretly talking to these therapists who channel them into the surgeon, into the body gynecology of the surgeon's knife. And so much of what Daly discusses happened up until 1978 is happening now, but it's self-chosen because of the ideology, and women girls are groomed into this. So I guess girls are groomed or channeled by the mind therapists into choosing self-sterilization via transgenderism. So you could see it as a branch of gynecology. And this is another quote from Daly. She says, the medical establishment soon found that its colonization of women's bodies required the concomitant conquests of their minds and spirits. Just what's happening now. The new theology of therapy has fulfilled this role, extending its tentacles into the privacy of minds and hearts. I think if you read this chapter, she could be talking about exactly today's situation, where you get therapy taking women away from the struggle and channeling them straight to the surgeon's knife, or to self-doubt, to self-hatred. Anyway, so that's Mary Daly's stuff. There's lots more, but it's, that's in a nutshell some of it. So Lila, I'll pass over to you now.
My experience is of actually working in the mental health services for many years. I'm now retired, but in my last piece of work, I worked in what was considered to be, in the UK, high secure services with very extremely marginalized, labeled, abused women. And throughout my career in this area, to me, the mental health services had very little therapy to offer. If we're talking about therapy, as I understand it from a feminist perspective, as one who had done consciousness raising in the late 70s and early 80s, I knew the value of it. But I think, as Greer said, the idea of women getting together and discussing their lives and their experiences is something that society doesn't want. It would prefer, as both Joe and our two other presenters have said, that girls and women enter individual rooms and see their issues as individual, rather than socially constructed by patriarchal and psychiatry from the onset. I've always found that one of the most disturbing aspects of locking women away is with the need to fix them, that in some way they are the problem. But we've learned with the anti-psychiatry commentary that's been made that that was turned around in some ways to state that no, it's with people's circumstances, and for women it's their sex-based what I call oppression that in many aspects created women's rebellion against oppression, often labeled as a mental health experience and an isolated one. Somebody asked about medication, and from my own experience, both in terms of women in general, exhibiting distress about their lives and oppression, medication became a great thing, that we would put women on tablets, pills to make them quiet, to suppress their anger and their feelings of violation in a society that rejected their views and their rights to autonomy and the right to speak, very much like we experience today. I mean, I do have great concerns about the mental well-being of young women and women in their 30s and 40s and so on, when they live in a culture that says you are erased, that as a woman you no longer exist. So we have moved from being fixed to being erased, and I think that's a massive issue that isn't being addressed and is going to create more and more distress amongst women, younger women, and women approaching middle age, because they've actually lived in a culture that tells them they don't exist. In my work with very damaged and marginalized women, then what I had witnessed and worked against as an advocate for this particular group was challenging the medical cosh that was dished out like sweets to women. And then you would have incidents where on their notes that they were dopey, sleepy, not paying attention, and so on and so forth. And that without any reference to the fact that the drugs that they were being given by the psychiatrists were actually responsible for women's feelings being suppressed and their views and their energies being reduced to silence them and to fix them as they understood. There were at that time very little talking therapies, and the only what was available was psychotherapy. And I have witnessed and advocated on behalf of many women who would refuse to go to the psychotherapy sessions, and they were punished by being locked up in their cell for 24 hours without any freedom whatsoever. And that would remove choice from women, at least in the general sense that women had some level of choice about the type or the therapy, but to actually remove that choice for women under the guise of the Mental Health Act, to suppress their views about how they didn't feel that such psychotherapy was very helpful to them. While I was involved in this situation, cognitive behavioral therapy was another form of therapy that was being offered women. It was relatively new at that time, but it had any of these therapies that were being used had no feminist analysis about them whatsoever, and yet they were being delivered to women in these incarcerated situations. I mean, what cognitive behavior therapy turned out to try and do was to identify techniques that would change people's behaviors. And some of the behaviors that were trying to be changed were women actually trying to speak about their experiences, about the violence they'd experienced, about the poverty, about the oppression, about family. So in many respects, women entering these services would be, first of all, women who had experienced in the primary abuse against them in family life, And then they would move into institutions. And that, to me, and my organization, was called secondary abuse, because it was now the system that was abusing them, trying to fix them. I mean, there are many more things I could say about therapy. And I'm not quite sure whether the Women's Therapy Centre in London reopened after it was closed in 2019. That's something I'd like to check. But there are very few offers of feminist therapy. And yet women together, talking together about their experiences, is something that needs a lot more emphasis, so that young women in schools, young women would not be allowed to get together and talk about this gender ideology that's impacting their lives so severely, or whether wanting to dress in a non-conventional way, not feminized, why is that seen to be something that needs to be altered and fixed? It's all about fixing feminine. It's all about fixing women and girls from its history to the present day. So I think this is a good start in conversation. I'd just finally like to mention that while I was involved in this system, electroconvulsive therapy was still being used in the years 2000, which is the most shocking form of therapy that could ever be offered to anyone, let alone a woman. And it was majority women that were receiving these therapies. And what it did was, in fact, enable you to lose your memory, to forget what had been done to you, to forget. And although a lot of women will come out and say, oh, my depression is lifted, I feel so much more myself, whatever that meant, but within a few weeks, that would all come back. And many, many women will become addicted to the electric convulsive therapy. So there are many dangerous therapies. And as I think Sheila mentioned, the therapists out there in the wide world don't even need to be monitored. There is organizations in UK that are monitoring them, but there is no way of them checking about the ethical basis or the benefits of any of therapies that are on offer. So I'll just leave it there, and thank you.
Mary Daly's analysis in gynecology is really useful because she looks at other, what she calls gynocidal practices. She looks at sati, which is the burning of wives if their husband dies, and Chinese foot binding, where mothers bound the feet of their daughters, so mutilated their daughters' bodies, and the system that caused that. FGM, female genital mutilation, she looks at that practice, and the European witch craze, that's what she called it, the European assault on or sort of women, outsider women or medical women, and she looks at all of those, and then she says that the current gynocide is gynecology, which is a really good insight, because we know that we could be outraged by, say, FGM or witch hunts and the killing of witches, but when you see this as the current form of the gynocide, you can see what is happening is that there is a systematic assault on women's bodies and a killing of women, of our minds and our bodies, and a cutting up of women's bodies. And so it's just fantastic insight. And then if you see transgenderism as just the new manifestation as part of gynecology, it fits perfectly. I'll just read a last bit from her. She says that what we need is the courage to find the focus of anger that can fuel and no longer block our passion and creativity. And then she says, radical feminism means that mothers do not demand self-sacrifice of daughters, and that daughters do not demand this of their mothers, as do sons in patriarchy. What Both demand of each other is courageous moving, which is mythic in its depths, which is spell-breaking and myth-making process. The sacrifice that is required is not mutilation by men, but the discipline needed for acting, creating together on a planet which is under the reign of terror, the reign of the fathers and sons. So it's great. She's saying what we've been talking about is that sisterhood, the consciousness raising, the working together, the action against our oppression and against the sort of oppression by the sex class men against us, is the way forward, and breaking out of that. And that therapy is just a method of confusing us and stopping our process, our liberation struggle.
I wonder if I could just say some of the things that I've been saying in the chat about the effect of therapy on women's community, because this is a very important issue, and Leah mentioned it as well. Before therapy developed, the important thing in women's community was to be equal. So consciousness raising was about sitting around in circles. Nobody was in charge. We didn't, like the left did, have sort of secretaries and treasurers and chairmen and so on and so on. Everything was to be about equality, and it was to be based on friendship. Now, therapy totally trounced all of those ideas. First of all, it sets up a class of persons who, in theory, they have power over you. I mean, they know things about you, for instance, and in theory, they have some superior skills which will allow them to deal with your mind and with your happiness in the way that friendship can't. So it takes over from friendship. And there was a lot of writing at the time about the difference between friendship and therapy and what did that mean. And one of the most telling things was women saying things like they didn't know whether they should say hello to their therapists in the street. Now, before that, and remember at this time, there was a massive women's community, very, very powerful. There's nothing like that now. And maybe therapy is one of the reasons we don't have it now. But at that time, there was a very powerful women's community, and you'd say hello to everybody and chat to everybody in the street in the areas of cities where women lived. But once some women were therapists, they were in a different position. They could not say, hello, Susan, in the street, and they wouldn't want you to say anything or make eye contact because they professionalized. Relationships between women were being professionalized for the first time in a way which destroyed all those other methods of organizing that we'd sought to create. And one of the problems that was created, of course, was that some women who were therapists chose to have sexual relationships with the women who went to them, which is obviously completely ethically unsound because there's a huge difference in power, which was not acknowledged. And those therapists and the women they had relationships with would say, oh, it's all equal. We're all equal. We're women. There's no men in here because we're all women. It's all equal. But of course, that was not true. And there'd be relationships going on with therapists behind their girlfriend's back. Relationships were destroyed. All kinds of problems were created in communities by this new kind of relationship, which came from men, which came from men's ideas of psychiatry and psychology and so on, and were intruded into the women's community. So in many, many ways, the women's community was sort of turned upside down. And some feminists did say at the time, and some of us say now, that that was enormously harmful. I mean, now there isn't really a women's community at all. I mean, there's no areas of cities really where you can see everybody and worry about whether you're saying hello to them. That's just really happening now because our community has been so destroyed. But I think it's important to recognize that therapy is one of the forces, a force that came from male dominance, intruded into our community, and introduced power structures into our community that weren't there before that helped that to happen. We used to have lots of discussion about what was friendship, but what the hell was friendship? There were certain things that you had to keep secret for your therapist, and your therapist had to keep secret from everybody else. There's extraordinary relationships were created, which did not allow us to create the new kinds of relationships and community that we needed to do for our revolution. So I'm only saying that therapy is one of those forces, but I think it's certainly an important force in undermining and destroying the possibilities of community that we had.
Well, I feel like, my contribution was really from my personal experience, having sort of been born into the generation that I was born into, where, you know, I reflected back in my 30s, actually, that, you know, or actually later, maybe more like my 40s or 50s, that the 1980s was all about me. I mean, it really, maybe it started before, but to some degree, but it seemed like it was all about, you know, me and, you know, the hyper personalization of self, and this, you know, and so therapy fit into that. And I mean, I am of that generation that, and I said in my interventions that I benefited a little bit from the therapy in the beginning. It was only a couple of years on and off or whatever, but it was really about the therapy of the 12-step programs, and then what that opened up, which is about those friendships and that getting together, sitting in a room with a bunch of other women. It was only women, and talking about these horrific things that we would have. Some women had really horrific stories about, you know, about the things they had gone through. And that somehow, just at that point in my life, in my 20s, was just, it was just incredible. You know what I mean? And I feel really quite sad that those kinds of things don't exist anymore for young women. I think it was critical for I used the word brainwash. I said my brain needed to be washed. I needed to learn things about life that I would not have learned in a therapist's office or from my family, who I was living far away from anyway. So yeah, I absolutely have a totally sort of feel like I was in the crux of it, and then sort of grew out of it to be able to see it from a little bit higher up, and feel really grateful for having had that, and privileged for having had that experience. And I've never worked in the helping profession, so that my contribution is just from having been, you know, a participant in it. So that's all I want to add. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to hear how you were helped and supported by being in those groups, because what we need women's groups and women's friendships to support women. So that's really good to hear all of that.
Subject of women seeking support and help for their distress or depression. On LBC London radio this week, Sheila Fogarty, one of the anchor women, ran a 2-hour session on a recent survey about women's experience of seeking help. And apparently the responses were something like this. 33% of women that were interviewed were told that they're overthinking their feelings. 33% were told that they were too emotional, and that was dismissed. This is by their GPs, their first encounter. 31% said that they were not taken seriously. Another 27% said that hormones were always a question that the GP asked, and then moved on to 20% saying that were asked about their periods. And others accused of being too dramatic, and a quarter of the women interviewed just felt invisible. And I think that speaks reams about the level of distress and the lack of local women's groups and girls groups where women could talk through those issues that they have without being dismissed and told that they're attention seeking, which is a favorite word in mental health services, written all over women's notes from doctors and those caring for them. It's an issue I think we need to return to.
I really think we do. And there's so much here. It's so huge, because really we've forgotten all of this, or it's been pushed aside. And now that in a country like Britain, you're likely not to get any help anyway from mental health services from the state. Women definitely should be talking about what to do about all of these things, about diagnoses, about how to help each other. We need a whole new dawn on women and mental health. We really, really do. So I think it's good that we've been able to have this introductory discussion, and I hope we will come back to it.
The other thought I've had about this is that mothers would bind the feet of their daughters in Chinese foot binding. And what we have at the moment is not mothers binding the minds of their daughters, it's professional mothers. And I think that in quite a lot of areas that the profession of growing our daughters up, our daughters as women, as radical feminists or revolutionaries who want to fight oppression, you know, we should be bringing up our daughters to understand that we're fighting for our sex class and they should be joined into the struggle with us. But that's just been, the bringing up of children has been professionalized into letting teachers do it and letting these professional therapists who take our daughters into individual rooms secretly. And as Mary Daly says, they're more committed, these therapists are more committed to their male profession, to Jung and Freud and Big Pharma, and their paycheck than they are to the well-being of our daughters. So I sort of think that that's another insight that I've got from Daly, is that our relationship, not just with each other, which of course we should be doing, but with the young, has been taken away, and they just believe, and then they go in and believe the therapists know what they're doing, which is absolutely just completely a disaster for so many girls who said, like, I just was watching a detransitioner, or no, a girl who had transitioned. She said, I was sure that I was right because my therapist told me I was right. It's like, yeah, we know why the therapists are saying you should transition, but she actually believed that because a professional told her that meant it was true. This is a disaster. So yeah, I would say that.
About believing what doctors tell you, believing what the psychiatrists tell you, believe all of these things are meant to show a level of superiority in thinking that women need to get fixed. You know, you need to fix your thinking. And then you'll be okay, apparently, which obviously, from my experience, and lots of women who've undergone therapy, perhaps is not the case necessarily. I haven't had mental health services, and I haven't experienced therapy either. I asked about it once to a psychiatric friend of mine, and he said to me, "Do you want your thinking changed?" I said, "No, not really. I'm quite content with the way I think, being a radical feminist." He said, "Don't go near therapy."
We're going to now go on to our next speaker, and this is Carola López Moya. She's a psychiatrist with training in perinatal psychology. She's also the founder of the Association of the Magnolia Institute, which provides psychological support to mothers and fathers of children with disabilities and the mother of daughters with disabilities. She's author of the book, The Birth of a Resilient Mother, What Happens When Your Child Has a Disability. And these are both in Spanish, but I'm not going to read it in Spanish because I'll just read the English translation. The Sect, Transactivism and How They Manipulate Us. This book was recently published by Planeta de Libros, Book Planet. Carola is a feminist activist who's been persecuted by transactivism in Spain.
Vale. Bueno, pues yo quiero abordar los retos, dilemas, persecución y cancelación en el contexto actual, que fruto de toda la experiencia que os voy a contar ahora, pues escribí este libro que creo que además a María José, si me está escuchando, le va a ayudar, porque yo la estaba escuchando y he estado anotando un montón de cosas a ver si puedo arrojar un poco de luz, ¿no? Sobre todo esto que ella está viviendo, ¿no? Vivimos tiempos totalitarios donde una realidad tan básica y tangible como que las mujeres somos las hembras humanas adultas se está negando, y la sociedad al completo está siendo aleccionada por una doctrina sectaria que se basa en mentiras descaradas, como que el sexo se puede cambiar o que existe la identidad de género. El alma del siglo XXI, que es como yo lo llamo, ¿no? He identificado decenas de mentiras que no voy a enumerar ahora al completo, porque se alargaría bastante la ponencia. Pero tenemos que tener en cuenta que comunidades científicas, medios de comunicación y agentes políticos que defienden los derechos humanos han aceptado sin aplicar ni un ápice el pensamiento crítico a estas cuestiones tan peregrinas del activismo trans. Nos están haciendo creer que un hombre puede ser mujer solamente por su mera voluntad y a veces apelan al sentimentalismo y a su aspecto. Uno de los retos que vamos a tener que afrontar las feministas por delante es desmontar cada mentira de esta doctrina. Las mentiras se construyen con lemas muy simples y muy cortos, pero generan mucha confusión a cada persona que es captada por esta doctrina. Por ejemplo, una hija que acude a una charla de diversidad o directamente en el colegio o en el instituto se lo dan, o una amiga que acude a un evento para la prevención de la LGTBI-fobia y sale de allí pensando que la autodeterminación del sexo legal es un derecho humano, porque esto y no otra cosa es lo que quieren, es decir, autodeterminar el sexo que aparece en los documentos oficiales para beneficiarse de los pocos derechos que el movimiento feminista ha peleado durante mínimo 3 siglos. Suplantan a las mujeres en sus espacios, suplantar a las mujeres en sus espacios es un acto plenamente narcisista. Y por supuesto decirle a la gente joven que se puede cambiar el cuerpo sexuado es un engaño. Es un reto que puede ser extenuante, porque para desmontar un lema tan manido como, por ejemplo, las mujeres trans son mujeres, debemos apelar a la razón, debemos dar argumentos, vamos a tener que acudir a conocimientos científicos y una mentira de 5 palabras necesita, por ejemplo, varias páginas o minutos para ser desmontada. Las feministas debemos saber que mientras el transactivismo utiliza una vía periférica para hacer llegar la información a la población, nosotras vamos a tener que utilizar una ruta central, la de la razón, y me estoy refiriendo a procesos cognitivos. La vía periférica es un atajo cognitivo que se utiliza para inhabilitar la razón. Se apela al sentimentalismo, a la falacia de autoridad, a la simpatía o al atractivo. Por ejemplo, lo que le pasó a María José, de que la llamaron porque tenía que borrar un post porque había a una persona trans muy profundamente molesta, ¿vale? Digamos que es este atajo el que utilizan. Eso que haya mencionado ella concretamente es un tipo de control mental, de control a través de la vía de un control cognitivo, es decir, como inundar a las personas de unos problemas que realmente no tienen. Es decir, que una persona escriba un post y le afecte profundísimamente, eso es como de mucha inmadurez, ¿vale? ¿Entendéis? Quiero poner este ejemplo porque María José lo ha traído muy bien a colación para que se entienda, ¿vale? Debemos también tener en cuenta que los actos del transactivismo están muy cuidados. Mencionan muchas veces las palabras derechos humanos, apelan a la libertad y a la felicidad. Y a veces desde la razón es difícil crear una grieta en esta coraza emocional, pero tenemos que intentarlo, como ha dicho María José, tenemos que buscar una estrategia. Yo creo que estamos en el camino de crear conjuntamente, además a nivel internacional, porque la estrategia que utiliza el transactivismo es la misma en todos los países, una guía pedagógica que sea fácil de entender y sirva de argumentario a todas, incluso a las que van llegando detrás de su pic trans, es decir, la vuelta al pensamiento crítico. Bueno, otro reto, ¿no?, que creo que tenemos que hacer, que es la pedagogía, que María José, por ejemplo, está viendo especialmente dificultades porque controlan la información, es decir, este movimiento utiliza estrategias sectarias y lo que hacen cuando así de forma muy sutil le van poniendo dificultades es para controlar la información, que es un tipo de manipulación ambiental, ¿vale? Pero tenemos que intentar hacer que nuestro mensaje llegue a muchísima gente. A mí me ha gustado mucho la idea de María José de preguntar por los conceptos, porque una cosa que hacen las sectas en general y esta en particular es cambiar el sentido de las palabras, y por eso se crea este enredo teórico monumental. Y además en un tema que afecta profundamente a los derechos de las mujeres y de la infancia. Hay un experto en sectas, que es el señor Cuevas, que dice que la totalidad de la secta es un timo, ¿vale? Es decir, todos los mensajes del dogma son mentiras, por ejemplo, como que el sexo se puede cambiar, que existe una identidad de género, que las intervenciones farmacoquirúrgicas son reversibles, que en función de cómo te comportes eres mujer u hombre, es decir, todo son mentiras. Hay decenas. Tenemos que tener en cuenta que para hacer pedagogía vamos a tener que hacer un esfuerzo extra porque la censura nos pone un paso por detrás de la casilla de salida. Es lo que dice María José, si la universidad a ella no le da espacio y sin embargo se lo da a otro que sí es queer, pues a ella le va a resultar más difícil llegar al alumnado, ¿vale? Por eso nos encontramos que tenemos que hacer unos esfuerzos extraordinarios para llegar a las personas, pero creo que, como hemos demostrado en otra ocasión, pues lo vamos a poder hacer, porque tendremos que utilizar métodos más sencillos, por ejemplo, boca a boca entre amigas, vecinas, madres del colegio, y utilizar las redes sociales, incluso hacer reuniones de vecinas, de barrio, ¿vale? A nivel como más personal, porque está en juego el futuro de nuestras hijas y de nosotras mismas. Bueno, un reto que vamos a tener que superar todas las que queramos exponernos o que por casualidad este movimiento sectario nos exponga es la acusación de transfobia. Cuando a una mujer la acusan de transfobia solo por no comulgar con las creencias de la doctrina trans, lo que pretenden es generar miedo, ansiedad y culpa. Es un tipo de manipulación basada en el control emocional. De esta manera, la propia mujer se va a callar y se autocensurará, sobre todo si ve posibilidad de perder su trabajo o medio de vida. El jueves pasado, en España, una asociación trans ha denunciado a una empleada de un supermercado porque llamó caballero varias veces a un señor que cree que es una mujer. Cuando él le dijo que era una mujer trans, la empleada se disculpó, pero le volvió a llamar caballero. La presión que hemos ejercido las feministas en España y la viralización de este hecho ha hecho que el supermercado decida que no despide a la empleada, pero que va a imponer un protocolo para que no vuelva a ocurrir. Es decir, van a obligar a la plantilla a validar los delirios de personas que están dentro de este movimiento. La propia Irene Montero, nuestra ministra de Igualdad, ha mostrado su apoyo a este varón con un tuit, que es lo que ella hace mucho, pero sin embargo, cuando asesinan a una mujer, incluso de las formas más brutales, lo que obtenemos es un tuit plantilla que llamamos, es decir, un copia y pega de una plantillita que ella tendrá y que es la que utiliza para cuando aparece asesinada una mujer en nuestro país. Pero este varón, que podéis ver ahí, que está la foto que es de internet, vamos, que ha salido él en todos los medios, pues tiene el apoyo de nuestra ministra de Igualdad, que además ha casi puesto en juego, si no lo ha puesto, porque veremos a ver la empresa si cumple su palabra o no, un puesto de trabajo de una trabajadora. Es decir, que esto es bastante grave. Pero no solamente, bueno, este es un caso más, porque yo misma viví esta situación en el año 2021, por unos tuits que yo puse, me denunciaron dos asociaciones de personas trans por decir yo en mi Twitter que el sexo no se puede cambiar y que a la infancia hay que dejarla en paz y educarla libre de estereotipos sexistas, y pedían para mí 120.000 euros de multa y 5 años de inhabilitación en mi profesión como psicóloga. Al final, después de 6 meses de defensa, también con una abogada que tuve que contratar, pues la Junta de Andalucía, mi comunidad autónoma, que es la organización territorial que tenemos aquí en España, pues estimó que yo tenía libertad de expresión y que no me podían aplicar esas multas y que yo no tenía ninguna responsabilidad para, o sea, que no había ninguna base. Pero claro, esto no es una cuestión solamente ideológica, ni siquiera psicológica, es decir, están jugando en el terreno de lo material porque son nuestros derechos básicos, es nuestra economía, es el sustento de nuestras familias. Y es verdad que creo, como ha dicho María José muy bien, que cada una tenemos que evaluar hasta qué punto nos podemos exponer, pero que sí es cierto que todas, incluso en el más absoluto anonimato, podemos tener una cuenta en nuestra red social para seguir extendiendo este mensaje, y otras estamos en el polo opuesto, donde podemos salir con nuestro nombre y apellido a hablar de esto. No sé si sufriendo daños o no, porque esto no sé si tendrá alguna consecuencia, pero sí bordeando los márgenes de la mordaza que tienen las leyes identitarias. Yo sí apelo a que otras mujeres y otros hombres que crean realmente en la democracia y los derechos humanos, que ostentan cargos políticos, sí tienen que sacudirse el miedo y canalizar nuestras voces. No puede ser que seamos las mujeres de a pie las que nos juguemos el tipo. Aunque sí es verdad que hay algunas con nuestras profesiones que sí podemos ser agentes facilitadores para que llegue a nuestro mensaje. Yo le pido pues a periodistas, políticas, artistas, a escritoras, psicólogas, psiquiatras, enfermeras, médicas, biólogas, abogadas, docentes, trabajadoras sociales, que si tienen alguna posibilidad, pues den un paso al frente para posicionarse en contra de esta ideología tan dañina con la infancia y la adolescencia. Pero también con nuestros roles más cotidianos, haciendo divulgación con nuestras madres, las hijas, las hermanas, las abuelas, amigas, tías. Y sí es verdad que si alguna está cansada o tiene miedo, aquí tenemos que cuidarnos, echarnos atrás, y el resto pues estamos ahí para cubrirla, ¿no? Bueno. Creo que, bueno, este es os he contado un poco esto, ¿no? Este dilema del ejercicio de la libertad de expresión, ¿no? Me gustó mucho esta diapositiva, esta imagen que ha hecho alguien que no, ahora mismo no le puedo poner el nombre, que dice, ¿qué ves en ¿qué ves en esta foto, Winston? Un hombre. Y si el partido te dijese que es una mujer, ¿no? Un poco haciendo referencia a esta cita de 1984 de Orwell. Y bueno, creo que recoge muy bien este problema que tenemos ahora mismo con la libertad de expresión. Una vez una mujer me comentó, ¿no? El descrédito. Este es otro dilema al que tenemos que enfrentarnos. Algunas mujeres me dicen, bueno, es que claro, a mí me preocupa cuando también me llaman, si no me llaman TERF o transfoba, me llaman facha, ¿no? Aquí hay un partido de tintes machistas, clasistas, racistas y homófobos que está instrumentalizando al feminismo. Y, por ejemplo, a la empleada que os he comentado antes, el sindicato que pertenece a ese partido le ha ofrecido ayuda a la trabajadora. Es decir, nada más que tiene que poner la cesta para coger los frutos, ¿no? Y ahora, de cara a las elecciones que tenemos aquí en España, pues esto puede ser pues, un desastre. Evidentemente, yo lo que quiero reflexionar es que, como precisamente son machistas, saben que es el sexo una realidad material y que sobre esta realidad material es sobre la que se ha construido una política que produce jerarquía entre hombres y mujeres, poniéndoles a ellos en una posición de dominio. Lo que dice el feminismo es que es una teoría y práctica política de justicia y una ética con profundas raíces civilizatorias, como dice Amelia Valcárcel, que reconoce los sexos y que lo que pretendemos es deshacer esa jerarquía. Por eso parece que coincidimos con la derecha, pero es natural porque precisamente la derecha, con su análisis básico de la realidad orgánica, son los que están más interesados en que eso siga bien, igual, ¿vale? Es decir, tanto la jerarquía, es decir, tanto la definición de los sexos como también la jerarquía, ¿vale? Es decir, no, la derecha no va a cambiar la jerarquía para que salgamos de nuestra posición de subordinación. Por eso yo creo que debemos superar al miedo, otra vez, a ser llamadas fachas o similar, porque el transactivismo va a utilizar este argumento para desacreditarnos como fuente de información dentro de sus estrategias de manipulación basadas en el control cognitivo. La estrategia aquí pasa por hacer una divulgación masiva de los textos del análisis materialista del feminismo, incluso sin entrar en lo trans. Se puede hacer divulgación con un lenguaje sencillo, porque de lo que se trata es de llegar a todas las mujeres, incluso para las que no tengan formación feminista o académica. Yo creo que el feminismo debe ser asequible para todas. ¿Y cómo combatimos la persecución? Bueno, la persecución a la que estamos sometidas las mujeres que confrontamos los dogmas transqueer es constante como un segundero de un reloj. El goteo de mujeres acusadas de transfobia, despedidas, despojadas de sus espacios laborales, desacreditadas, no cesa. Los activistas trans utilizan las leyes que previamente han colocado ahí con subterfugios y engaños para amedrentar a las mujeres. Yo observo que mientras ellos judicializan cualquier nimiedad, como el caso de la cajera o lo que me pasó a mí, como he dicho antes, ¿no? El caso de la cajera que llamó caballero a un varón que se cree mujer, las mujeres apenas utilizamos el derecho para defendernos de los ataques. Evidentemente jugamos con desventaja, puesto que mientras ellos obtienen dinero de fundaciones queer, que a su vez están bien suministradas económicamente por la industria farmacológica y médica, nosotras tenemos trabajos precarios. Creo que debemos organizarnos para hallar un método que nos permita financiar las demandas que interpongamos o las que nos interpongan. Porque cuando empiecen a ser condenados en costas, cuando las clínicas de identidad de género tengan que pagar indemnizaciones millonarias por hacer intervenciones farmacoquirúrgicas a menores que no están preparados para nada, cuando una asociación sea denunciada por delitos de coacción y abuso y alguien vaya a la cárcel, entonces será cuando comience el principio del fin de este movimiento. Bueno, con respecto a la cancelación, como resultado de toda esta ofensiva basada en las mentiras, las acusaciones de transfobia, el descrédito a través de la acusación de fascistas y la coacción por la pérdida del trabajo, a muchas personas que se dedican a la divulgación, como es el caso de María José y también la investigación, están siendo censuradas en sus ambientes de trabajo y medios de comunicación. Por ejemplo, ha mencionado María José a Silvia Carrasco, una de las autoras del libro La coeducación secuestrada, que sin ir más lejos, junto a José Rasti, han dedicado horas a conceder unas entrevistas para un programa de televisión pública autonómica en Cataluña, porque estaban haciendo un reportaje sobre el fenómeno trans. Y
Tienes 2 minutos, Carola,
vale,
por
termino,
favor.
ya me queda muy poco. Le llamaron para decirles que iban a suprimir sus testimonios porque no era acorde con el discurso actual, un poco como lo que ha contado María José. Bueno, Juana Gallego, Amelia Valcárcel, Laura Redondo, Tasia Aránguez, Irene Aguiar, Paula Fraga, Nuria Coronado, Laura Estrego, son algunas de las mujeres canceladas en España y la lista a nivel internacional es interminable. Yo, a modo de propuesta, voy a pincelada. Primero, tener un argumentario para desmontar las mentiras del transactivismo. Seguir escribiendo, haciendo charlas, guías, folletos, podcasts, de forma anónima, dando la cara, como sea, pero cada mujer tiene que empezar a crear su propio contenido. Extender la red de mujeres informadas y formadas del boca a boca, a través del boca a boca, e incluso haciendo pequeños grupos en sus localidades, porque sí me consta que hay mujeres con entornos machistas muy fuertes que se sienten solas. Fortalecer nuestra autoestima, porque los embistes del transactivismo al grito de transfobia, nos van a afectar. Entonces tenemos que aferrarnos a nuestros criterios y a nuestra sabiduría. Que nadie nos haga luz de gas y pensemos que estamos equivocadas. Conocer las estrategias de manipulación y no caer en sus trampas. Tener una base sólida de conocimiento, pues significa que nos va a permitir tener la mente clara ante estas acusaciones. Y creo que finalmente crear un método de financiación para demandar la vulneración de nuestros derechos. Quizá tengamos que acudir a mujeres expertas en movimiento asociativo, tesoreras, economistas, que puedan ayudar a organizar o alguna asociación que custodie con todas las garantías, evidentemente, una caja de resistencia feminista, porque creo que todavía no hemos vivido lo peor del transgenerismo. Y espero que os haya resultado útil mi aportación. Gracias.